My name's Helen Christians, and I will be your MC this morning. I'd like to welcome you to the Sunday morning meeting of the Humanists of Greater Portland. The Humanists of Greater Portland is a chapter of the American Humanist Association, and as humanists, our members believe in a progressive philosophy that without supernaturalism advocates living an ethical life based on science, reason, and free inquiry. The American Humanist Association has developed a list of 10 commitments, and these 10 commitments are just a gentle guide that puts our humanist beliefs into action. Our topic at today's meeting, Mental Immune Collapse, Mind Parasites and the Roots of Mass Irrationality, addresses several humanist commitments, including critical thinking, ethical development, service and participation, and finally, responsibility. You can check out HGP and AHA's websites for additional information about these commitments. Lauren Beauregard is our reader this morning. Lauren, do you want to come in?
This morning it's about Karl Marx, and what I'm about to read, as Helen just pointed out, is certainly not going to be any official view of our organization, but it's something that's interesting. Marxism has had a long and troubled relationship with religion. In 1843, the young Karl Marx wrote that religion is, quote, the opium of the people. It's a phrase that would harden into official atheism for the communist movement, though it poorly represented the true opinions of Karl Marx himself. After all, Marx also wrote that religion is, quote, the sentiment of a heartless world, the soul of conditions that have no soul, as if to suggest that even the most fantastic beliefs bear within themselves a protest against worldly suffering and a promise to redeem us from conditions that might otherwise appear beyond all possible change. To call Karl Marx a secularist, then, may be too simple. Marx saw religion as an illusion, but he was too much of a dialectician to claim that religion could simply be waved aside without granting that even illusions point darkly toward truth. See where dialectical materialism can take you? Well, now, this reading raises in my mind two questions to which I do not have ready answers. First, why do religious people think that they need religion in order to deal with reality? Really, I don't. Second, why do secular people think that they can do without religion, given the reality to which we are all embedded? I think I need to do more thinking about that one. And that's it.
I would now like to welcome today's speaker, Andy Norman. Andy directs the Humanism Initiative at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He studies how ideologies short-circuit minds and corrupt moral understanding. In his book, Mental Immunity, with a foreword by Steven Pinker, Andy lays out the conceptual foundations of cognitive immunology. In today's presentation, Andy will identify the root causes of mass irrationality and argue that society can inoculate minds against unhinged thinking. Andy, your work is certainly critical during these times of the big lie, QAnon, and anti-vaccine propaganda. Welcome, Andy. Come on in and please share your knowledge with us this morning. Andy will be taking questions at the end of his presentation.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you all for being here today. So I'd like to start off with some questions for you all. How many of you, say sometime in the last month, have been reading a newspaper or reading about current events and have had the thought, our species is going crazy? Wave your hand if you've had that thought. Interesting. Okay. I don't know if you all can see as many faces as I can. I have you in gallery view, but almost everybody waved their hand there. Second question. How many of you have just, when learning about the content of, say, QAnon beliefs or the big lie or learning about how the vaccine hesitant folks are thinking about the COVID thing, have had the thought, how many of you have just been astonished by what passes for thinking these days? Okay, good. Yeah, once again, it looks like near consensus on that. How many of you are worried about the levels of partisan division in our nation? So these are the problems that I've spent about 30 years thinking about. And I believe I've come to an understanding of the problem that sheds light on the root causes, and also points to some really interesting and powerful solutions to a problem that I think too many feels hopeless. So I'm hoping that by sharing the ideas at the heart of the book Helen mentioned, that I can give you hope and give you tools that you can apply to help us fight the epidemics of nonsense that we're seeing today. I want to start by saying that I think you've probably come across the Albert Einstein quote, problems cannot be solved at the same level of thinking that created them. That was Einstein. And with that quote, he was indicating that sometimes we need kind of a fundamental shift in the way we view things if we're going to solve the problems that seem intractable. And I think that's the situation here. I think that the standard answer to the question, why is this happening? Why are crazily divisive and irrational ideologies spreading? That the standard answer to that question is deeply inadequate and not up to the task of protecting internet-connected minds from various forms of viral nonsense. Let me see if I can characterize what I call the standard view. And it's maybe one that you have found yourself drawn to at one time or another. It goes like this. The world is composed of critical thinkers and people who are not critical thinkers. We critical thinkers, and almost everyone I know classifies themselves that way, we critical thinkers have learned certain skills, perhaps at a university or perhaps from our parents or our friends, that essentially make us immune to the worst forms of cognitive contagion. We wield these critical thinking skills in ways that essentially protect our minds, but there are many, and we combine them with an underlying skepticism or an underlying inclination to ask questions that many people who we disagree with just don't have. There are lots of other people out there, in other words, I think many of us believe this, who don't have critical thinking skills or who are fundamentally non-skeptical or gullible. And they're the ones who are highly susceptible to QAnon sense, to coin a term. Now, again, I think this view is inadequate for a number of reasons. And the best way to illustrate that, I think, is to spell out the alternative and then point to some of the differences between the story we've been telling ourselves, I think, for several decades, the one I just told, and what I think of as a better story, which is again outlined in the book Helen mentioned, which is called Mental Immunity. So first and foremost, I think we need to get used to the idea that bad ideas are not just inert content. Our minds are not active agents that can unproblematically accept or reject ideas at purely on the basis of will. In fact, there are many ideas now that are spreading across the internet that clearly have properties that make them infectious. When you think about the way in which some of the QAnon beliefs, the idea that those guys on the other side of this culture war are pedophiles and Satanists. These ideas are just patently manipulative ways of gratifying your need to be on the side of the angels but they bear no relationship whatever to reality. And so it's pretty easy for us at least, to recognize them as ideas that propagate because they infect minds despite their lack of accuracy, despite their lack of truth. Think about some other properties of bad ideas. So some bad ideas are infectious. Every bad idea requires a host. Bad ideas can actually induce the mind that hosts them to behave, can trigger behaviors that get those ideas spread to other minds. So when an evangelical, when the beliefs of an evangelical inspire them to proselytize, that's the evangelical beliefs manipulating their hosts to spread to other minds. And when a really fascinating meme that validates your political perspective pops up in your Facebook feed and you click share, it's not incorrect to say that that meme has induced you to serve its interests in spreading. Scientists who study these phenomena recognize that that way of putting it is just as accurate and in some cases more revealing than our standard way to think of it, where the ideas themselves are just inert content, our minds are completely in the driver's seat. Turns out that's not true. And if you watch bad ideas spread across the internet in ways that defy anyone's intent, it's pretty clear that we need to change our view that ideas are simply inert and our minds are always in the driver's seat. So I want to encourage you to think of bad ideas as mind parasites. When I talked about bad ideas as requiring a host, and being able to induce certain behaviors, as capable of spreading, as infectious, and oftentimes harmful to the very hosts that harbor them, basically what we're saying is that bad ideas check all the boxes. They have all of the properties of parasites. And so it's a kind of a new and a little bit creepy way to think about it, but it's not a way without a scientific basis. There are actually extremely good philosophical and scientific reasons for treating bad ideas as mind parasites. There's a study, a couple of my colleagues who work in this space have argued in a really interesting paper that the spread of witchcraft beliefs in early modern Europe cannot be properly understood except by viewing it as a thought contagion, where the witchcraft beliefs themselves are mind parasites that infected people and induced a kind of hysteria, a kind of moral panic. I think that's not an isolated case. I think bad ideas, I think every single one of us has a mind that is infected with some mind parasites. And if that way of talking about it creeps you out too much, just plug in the word bad idea. I think you'll probably agree that most of us harbor bad ideas. But it turns out that the conceptual lens provided by the mind parasite idea opens our eyes to all kinds of ways in which we could be doing a better job of preventing mind infections from spreading. I actually think what we're witnessing in our time is a paradigm shift that is allowing us to actually get control of some of the infectious agents that have been manipulating human minds for generations. Second key idea in the book is that minds actually have immune systems. And this is not a metaphorical claim. I think I want you to take this claim literally. Now, at some level, it's just trivially true. So if you define a mental immune system as a mind's wherewithal for spotting and removing bad ideas, then it just follows axiomatically that our minds do in fact have immune systems that protect us from infectious ideas, the same way our body's immune systems protect us from infectious microbes. If you think about the fact that the wrong ideas could probably get our ancestors killed, it starts to become clear, I think, that our minds had to evolve immune systems to keep our ancestors alive. And of course, we've inherited some of the same infrastructure for spotting and removing bad ideas. Now, of course, these systems function imperfectly. Their job is to keep out the bad ideas and the falsehoods and let in the good ideas and the true beliefs. But every mental immune system in existence, I think, fails in two ways. It lets in some bad ones and screens out some good ones, which means that every single one of us falls short of perfect mental immune health. We all have work to do to become more responsible epistemic agents. Epistemic is a fancy philosopher's word for matters relating to cognition. We can all do a better job of managing our cognitive responsibilities to keep out bad ideas and let in good ones. Now, the idea that minds actually literally have immune systems is, I think, to some degree originates with me. I like to think that my book develops that idea more fully and more explicitly and more directly than anyone else has done. But the evidence, the actual empirical evidence that minds have immune system goes back at least 50 or 60 years. In the early 1960s, a psychologist named William McGuire discovered that if you expose a mind to a weakened form of an argument and then poke holes in it, you can actually induce that mind to become resistant to even stronger versions of the same argument. You may recognize this as like the straw man rhetorical strategy, right? When Donald Trump gets up in front of an audience and caricatures the liberal perspective, disdains it, heaps disdain or ridicule upon it, he's actually priming his followers' minds to reject even good arguments for progressivism. So it turns out that would-be demagogues, propagandists have been using tactics that manipulate our mind's immune systems for many, many, many centuries. Incidentally, there is now a new generation. So this guy McGuire recognized that the exposure to a weakened form induces immunity, even to stronger versions of the same argument. He recognized that as analogous to inoculation. So he called his theory inoculation theory. And implicit in that idea, going all the way back to the 1960s, is that our minds have something like an immune system, and that it is, at least in principle, impossible to inoculate those minds against some of the worst mind parasites. So a new generation of inoculation theorists is actually testing out techniques for inoculating minds against, say, science denial or against conspiracy thinking. And they're discovering that certain things work. You can increase a mind's resistance to a kooky conspiracy theory using content, and you can also use it by rebutting the strategies or the argument strategies used to support the conspiracy theories. There are ways to do this, which doesn't make it easier, by the way, to talk a science denier out of their position. But there is, in principle, at least hope for this. By the way, there's when I mentioned talking somebody out of, say, QAnon conspiracy theory, you can probably all see that that's a tall order. It turns out that prevention is a lot more effective than cure. It's easier to prevent a QAnon mind infection than it is to cure one. I like to say that an ounce of mind inoculation is worth a pound of cult deprogramming. And so the tools that I develop in the book are more about helping us prepare future generations from ever falling down conspiracy theory rabbit holes in the first place, which doesn't mean I'm ready to give up on all of your crazy Uncle Franks who wreck Thanksgiving dinner with their kooky accusations. There are some strategies that can work with them too, but there are people who work on that aspect of the problem with more research finesse than I can bring. It turns out that doubts are the antibodies of the mind. So in around, I think it was around 1900, a Russian zoologist took a starfish larva, stabbed it with a citrus thorn, stuck it under a microscope, and watched as the starfish's white blood cells swarmed to the scene of the injury, engulfed the tip of the thorn, and tried to consume it, began to consume it. This guy Mechnikov was the first person ever to witness the body's immune system in action. And what he discovered is that there are little shock troops coursing through our veins that are ready to rush to the scene of a threat and to try to neutralize that threat. Now, next time somebody challenges an idea really, really central to your identity, pay attention to what happens in your mind. Here's what happens in my mind. My mind starts to generate doubts, qualms, reservations, objections, challenges, all kinds of reasons to try to neutralize what it perceives as a threat. Sometimes this is a good thing, because sometimes the threatening information really is wrong, really is destructive, really is false. But other times the threatening information is actually true and best absorbed or allowed to become part of your thinking. In my example of this is when I learned that Martin Luther King was not faithful to his wife, I refused to believe it, because I'd been raised to think of him as a moral paragon, right? I was raised in a family that thought Martin Luther King walked on water. And when I heard that he was a serial adulterer, my mind immediately started generating reasons to dismiss that information. One of them was, I bet you J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI created that rumor to smear King. That's consonant with facts we do know, so it fit right in. I let that idea into my mind, and it blocked out the idea, the truth, that King was less than faithful to Coretta Scott. So I think even us progressives have mental immune systems that misfire sometimes and screen out the wrong things. It's not uncommon to have for a mind to generate doubts and reservations about things that you shouldn't have doubts or reservations about. So the real trick to mental immune health is to have doubts, the right kind of doubts about the right things to the right degree. So it's not a case of us critical thinkers being good at generating doubts and picking out the bad ones, and those non-critical thinkers being incapable of this. In fact, if you sit down with a flat earth theorist, it turns out many of them have generated all kinds of doubts to things you've taken for granted your entire life. You have failed to ask questions as assiduously as your average flat earther on certain things. What redeems you is that they shouldn't be generating doubts about those things, right? Your mental immune system is actually functioning better than theirs is, because it's not entertaining doubts that it shouldn't have, whereas their minds are entertaining doubts that they shouldn't have. So mental immune health is much more complicated than was dreamt of within the critical thinking paradigm. And if we're going to understand how to inoculate our minds, we need to understand this greater complexity. Here's one of the things we know. If a young person goes to college and acquires critical thinking skills in the traditional sense, and by the way, those skills allow you to slice and dice arguments and almost always find gaps in them. Anybody with just a freshman introduction to argument analysis can find ways to poke holes in almost every argument. That's easy. But if somebody graduates from college without ever having been asked to question their political ideology, they can then put those critical thinking skills to work in defense of a stubbornly reason-resistant ideology. And our universities are busy cranking out many, many, many people like this. Some of them the most effective propagandists on the right. It's not that these people lack critical thinking skills, it's they apply their critical thinking skills to serve a stubbornly reason-resistant ideology. And the way to understand this phenomenon is that they suffer from a mental immune disorder of a kind, and that we actually need better tools for strengthening mental immune systems against this kind of disorder. I'm here. Okay, a few more things. One question that I think it's really important to ask is, what compromises mental immune health? What is it that causes somebody's mind to lose its ability to spot and remove bad ideas? One of them is a phenomenon called identity protective cognition. So it turns out we're all prone to this. A Yale psychologist named Dan Kahan has some wonderful research on this. But it turns out that if you hitch your identity to certain core beliefs, then any information or questions that come up and challenges that identity or those beliefs will induce a threat response from you. It will often put your mind into fight or flight mode, and it will start generating antibodies to attack the threatening information. In other words, if you hitch your identity to an ideology and people start to question that ideology, your mind's immune system will often overreact to the threat. The antidote to that, of course, is to be really careful how you define your identity. It's a good idea, by the way, better to hitch your identity to the concept of honest inquiry than to any particular belief that might or might not survive honest inquiry. And I actually credit humanists like yourselves with having adopted a pretty reasonable identity. I think because honest inquiry is close enough to the heart of what humanism is all about, that's a relatively healthy identity to have chosen. I consider myself a humanist as well, but I also hold that identity lightly so that if questions come along to challenge my humanism, I can hear what they have to say and learn from them. In the book, I talk about a bunch of ideas that are at large in our culture today that are effectively immune disruptive. These are ideas that actually diminish our capacity to examine ideas and filter out the bad ones. One of these ideas is the idea that everyone is entitled to their opinion. People now wield this idea to protect irresponsible beliefs. And we live in an ethos, a culture where an ethos that makes us all feel cognitively entitled. We're all entitled to believe whatever we darn please, no matter what effects that might have on the long-term well-being of the planet or each other. And this sense of entitlement is not serving us well. But the idea that everyone is entitled to their beliefs goes way back to the beginnings of the Enlightenment. And it has deep roots among the very same people who founded humanism and who wrote the Constitution of the United States. It's time now that we rethought that, because our cognitive rights, while important, have to coexist with our cognitive responsibilities. And when we reflexively invoke our cognitive rights to suppress our cognitive or any awareness of our cognitive responsibilities, our minds become simply more susceptible to bad ideas. Turns out the idea that values are subjective is similarly immune disruptive. So if you're drawn to the idea that values are subjective, you can actually strengthen your mind's immune system considerably by rethinking that view. Because on that view, there's really no good reason why any one value is better than any other, because, hey, it's all just subjective. And once, if that thought occurs to you and it prevents you from engaging in value inquiry and learning how to deepen your understanding of right and wrong, that's preventing your mind from becoming stronger and more subtle and more discriminating. So the book goes on to describe exactly why that view is also a mental immune disruptor and how we can strengthen our culture's immune system by rejecting it. It turns out that there's a fascinating bit of research out of Canada that came out just last year that says that when a person is committed to changing their minds in the face of evidence, that their minds are relatively immune to all kinds of weird things like science denial and conspiracy thinking and religious fundamentalism. But once you begin to compromise that view, that beliefs should change in response to evidence, you become more susceptible to all of the above. In other words, the idea that we are obliged, morally obliged, to update our beliefs every time new evidence comes in, every time, especially every time surprising or evidence comes in. That idea is the linchpin of the mind's immune system. If we can raise the future generations to understand that that's an absolutely central moral responsibility, we can raise the next generation to be dramatically less susceptible to kooky forms of thinking. I'm guessing that as fellow humanists, you also have qualms about faith and the ways in which religious people accept things, not on the basis of evidence, but because it's a virtue to believe things, even despite the lack of evidence. Well, it turns out that if you raise your children to believe that, you're leaving their minds more susceptible to mind infections than if you teach them, no, faith is not a get out of jail free card for people who want to believe whatever they want. That the concept cannot function in that capacity without weakening mental immune systems. So many people ask, what can we do? What should we be doing differently when this new science of mental immunity, I call it cognitive immunology, what are the practical takeaways of this new science? Because how do we behave differently in our day-to-day lives so as to make a difference? One thing you can do is learn to listen to your doubts. My guess is most of you guys are pretty good at this already, but help other people understand that this is really important. Again, doubts are the antibodies of the mind. And when you habitually pay attention to them, you start to notice things. You notice that various ideas have defects and downsides that you might not spot otherwise. And even if you end up relying on that idea to some degree, it's important to be aware of the defects and downsides so that you don't buy into it overmuch or become overly attached to it. So listen to your doubts and help, and when you converse with others, help create a shared conversation space where everyone can hear their doubts. If everybody's too busy talking too fast and you're just shooting ideas out fast, nobody has time to actually notice that doubts sneak in and begin to warn us of dangerous ideas if we allow them. Understand that challenges aren't threats, they're opportunities. So when somebody else comes along and raises doubts about your favorite ideas, fight down the urge to lash out or to strike back or to defend your view, and dwell for a little bit on the possibility that this challenger might have something to teach you. Even if it's a Trumpy or a QAnon believer, do them the courtesy of letting their challenges register with you and consider if there is anything you can learn from them. Just giving their doubts a space, enough space so you can hear them, gives them permission to hear your doubts. Nobody wants to listen to other people's challenges unless they're willing to listen to theirs. My pronouns are off there, but you get the idea. Does that make sense? When you open yourself up to being persuaded by others, you also demonstrate in a very powerful way that you're worth listening to and that maybe they can learn something from you as well. So that kind of humility and that kind of openness can also be infectious, and we can inspire other people around us to listen and learn from us as we listen and learn from them. And by the way, dialogue, reason-giving dialogue only works to spot and remove bad ideas if the conversation is collaborative. when the conversation becomes combative, people's minds shut down. Their mental immune systems go freak out and start screening out stuff and preventing them from learning. So we have to learn how to de-escalate rhetorical culture wars, because culture wars are a huge threat to critical thinking and mental immune health. We have to, each and every one of us, create conversational spaces where reasons aren't treated as weapons, but are instead treated as pointers to draw one another's attention to genuinely relevant considerations. That's how you beat rhetorical swords into logical plowshares. And we all need to do that, I think, if we want to have productive, fruitful, and genuinely transformative conversations. And if enough of us have these kinds of conversations and invite people who differ with us into those conversations so that they can feel the power of that kind of dialogue, I think we can transform our culture within a decade. But it's going to require a lot of people applying some of the basic insights of cognitive immunology so that we can have better discussions, actually begin learning and building community with one another instead of just fault finding. So there's plenty more in the book that can take your practice of mind parasite fighting to another level. So I'd encourage you to check it out. If you're interested, I'll mention one other way you can get involved. I'm founding a nonprofit that's going to bring together all the top researchers in this field to map out basically an infodemic preparedness strategy for humanity in the internet age. Because right now we are sitting ducks. So many of our fellow human beings are highly susceptible to morally disorienting ideologies and ideas. But we can use science to understand how to combat that problem. And this nonprofit I'm forming would love, we're looking for allies and people who can help us apply its insights and people who can help to underwrite our operations. So if you're in a position to help with something like that, please do reach out to me after the talk. Guys, thank you very much. You've been a very attentive audience. I hope I haven't gone on too long. I'm eager to hear your questions.
Andy, yes. Oh, that was very powerful. I took some notes, and it's just such a, it's a new concept for me, I'll be honest. Let's see. Laurent, can you come in and ask your question, please?
Yes, Andy, thank you so much for that presentation. My question is kind of complicated, but I'm going to try to present it in as simple way as possible.
Okay.
I've been looking lately at the phenomenon of identity politics and the movement of anti-racism as expressed in a couple of books that have been on the bestseller list. For example, Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility and Ibram X. Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. And in accessing X. Kendi, I find that his views espousing anti-racism, the way he does, are very, very persuasive. So that's point number one to put in the background. Point number two is that I have just purchased a book by, hold your breath now, Charles Murray, yeah, the bell curve guy. And his latest book just come out is called Facing Reality. And it presents a view with which, by the way, Sam Harris agrees, Harris having had Charles Murray on his podcast 2 or 3 years ago, that there are certain real facts about the cognitive abilities and the crime rates among Black populations that constitute reality. And what this does is it, okay, bottom line, and I want to know how the principles in your book can help me address this. I'm being persuaded by two completely opposite sides of an argument. I'm being persuaded by X. Kendi's anti-racism thing, and I'm also being persuaded by Charles Murray's views about facing reality. Can you help me?
Oh, wow. Fascinating question and a really tricky one. So I don't know Murray's work on this, but I know roughly his the stance he takes. I've read a bit of Kendi's book as well, and also find that there's to be some really important ideas there. So the two positions you've just referred to have some very deep philosophical differences that divide them. So we shouldn't expect to resolve those differences easily or quickly. What really needs to happen is for genuinely open, heartfelt dialogue between people who represent Kendi's point of view and people who represent Murray's point of view. They needed to come together in dialogue and actually sort out which of their ideas are in need of revision or which ones need to be upheld. Now, that's a long conversation, and it's a complicated conversation, and it's a politically charged conversation. It's a difficult conversation. And unfortunately, I'm seeing hardened, you know how our arteries can harden? Well, our attitudes can also harden. And this issue of race in America, and Murray, of course, actually examined race and its relationship to intelligence and other, hot button issues. These are not issues that can be dealt with quickly and easily, but we're only going to sort them out if we make space for genuine dialogue where we can listen and learn from one another. I'd encourage you to get together with some of these marvelous co-congregants of yours and maybe try to work through them in a way. Understand that I actually see a kind of orthodoxy forming on the progressive left about identity. Certain forms of identity politics on the left are becoming, are hardening into orthodoxies in a problematic way. And that means that these issues have to be approached very carefully and patiently so that people don't get defensive and just turn the conversation into another battleground. So that short answer, but to a long, a full answer would have to be much longer, but I'll limit myself to that for now.
Thank you.
Andy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. We do have a question from Al Christians. Al, you want to come on and ask your question, please?
Yes, Andy, you talk about this immune system and the ways to question and such seem to be focused on determining truth or fact or something like that. I once was talking to a fellow who was trying to sell me some scientifically questionable ideas, and his philosophy, and he's a very respected fellow, was that science is whatever works. But I guess I make a distinction there and say, science is about truth, and that's not necessarily about what will work, because all the important questions involve people, and every person has their own crazy ideas.
Yeah.
So is your book anything about what will work, or is it just about ways to find the truth? And how do you manage to separate those two things?
That's a marvelous question, and it goes right to the heart of my philosophical project. So if I'm going to say bad ideas are mind parasites, I owe you a definition of what a bad idea is. Now, one very short way to answer that question is true ideas are good and false ideas are bad. But it turns out that ideas have causal properties as well as logical properties. And they have effects on our behavior as well as relationships to what I call upstream evidence. So think of it this way. Think of an idea that has been embedded in a belief. Now imagine that idea in the midst of a stream, that belief in the midst of a stream. It's related to various considerations that might or might not evidence it. And these considerations, think of those as upstream of the belief, since you would derive the belief from the evidence. But whatever the belief is, it wouldn't be a belief if it didn't have effects on our behavior, if it didn't change the way we treat one another, for example. science to this point in history has has tested ideas purely on the basis of upstream evidence without paying much attention to downstream consequences. The religions of the world are insistent on saying, hey, beliefs have an effect on my worldview, on my mindset, on whether I can trust other people, on my hopefulness. Right? Faith is really believing in order to bolster one's one's hope and one's ability to trust, I think. And to the extent that faith is a good thing, it promotes hope and trust. And I think that's a legitimate role. It's important that beliefs have that effect. And the fact that they have that effect is certainly morally relevant, quite apart from the truth or falsehood of the belief in question. So in chapter 6 of my book, I argued that beliefs have both upstream evidence and or lack thereof, and downstream consequences, and that a full-blown evaluation of that idea and its worthiness to be believed has to take both into account. In other words, we need to draw from the wisdom of both scientific traditions and religious traditions and learn to assess ideas for their truth and their usefulness. This is just another way of stating the core tenet of a philosophical view called pragmatism. But I developed that view, I think, in ways that open up the possibility of a science of right and wrong, a science of morals.
So if I could just follow up quickly, Franklin Roosevelt said he couldn't lead people where they're not willing to go. You think you can change where they're willing to go?
I certainly hope so.
Yeah. Andrew, the big issue. Dave DiNucci has a question. Come on in, Dave.
Yeah, I have lots of questions, but I'll try to make it short. And I mean, it's it's very interesting and it's wonderful to think this way. One of the questions, it relates to this idea that it's not just, I mean, you talk about an immune system, et cetera. Part of the immune system, it would seem, would be our knowledge, or I don't know if knowledge is the right word, but our, what we have learned about the world around us. We've created this model in our head of how things work. And we've done that in part by learning things. And so in another area you talked about, maybe identifying as a humanist, but not holding that tightly so that you can bring in questions and look at questions about that and be able to bring those in. So one of my questions relates to just whether or not number one, you need to hold, you need to keep that as a loose association, whether you can't, still keep this firm association of yourself as a humanist, but still be able to bring those questions in, et cetera. And well, I'll leave it at that for now, I guess.
Yeah, David, you've raised a couple of wonderful points and questions here. It's certainly true that when we evaluate a new piece of potential knowledge, a new piece of information, our existing beliefs and our existing knowledge are brought to bear in the assessment. So the worldview we've built to date offers kind of the first assessment of a new idea. And the basic test most of us apply is, will this new piece of information fit in with the ideas that are already on board, right? Now, it's not hard to see how following that. So imagine somebody adopting the rule, I will accept whatever fits in with what's already on board, and just keeps churning away in that mode. It's easy to see how a mind like that might spiral away from reality, right? Because some of the ideas on board might be false. And as you pile on other beliefs that fit in with those, your worldview becomes more and more and more divergent from reality. It could also diverge from the worldviews of the people around you, making it very difficult for you to get along with them. So the rule of thumb that says, check your beliefs to see if they fit in with those that are already on board is demonstrably dysfunctional.
Mhm.
It matters terribly that we rely on, that we test ideas against the genuinely reliable ones that are already on board, which is to say, the really truly evidence-based ones. You hinted at another question that I'll just try to treat very briefly. When I say it's a good idea that I try to hold my humanism loosely, I don't mean that in a way that deprives me of the courage of my convictions.
Yeah.
I try to be open to revising my views, but I also allow the views of mine that have stood the test of time and have withstood rigorous questioning to be deeply motivating and to get me to go out there and act on behalf of my beliefs in political ways and others. So it's terribly important that we not assume that conviction is the absence of open-mindedness. Conviction doesn't mean that you're closed-minded. We can combine open-mindedness and have the courage of our convictions if we do it right. And that's what chapter 12 untangles those.
I just would like, I wanted to understand a little more about, is this a physiological or biological thing that's happening in the brain with these parasites, these mind parasites? I'm trying to see if there's a physiological thing going on, or is it just somehow some other concept I'm not quite getting?
Yeah, so there is something physiological going on, but a mind parasite isn't a discrete chunk of matter that that can be isolated from the surrounding matter. So think about, so the question you're raising applies to all mental talk, like talk of beliefs and desires. Is a desire like a physiological thing? Well, is a belief a physiological thing? No, but it's somehow encoded in the brain, which is a physiological thing. Mm-hmm. So I want to say the same thing about bad ideas and mind parasites, which is that there's some physiological encoding needed for a mind parasite to exist. But that doesn't mean that you can isolate a particular chunk of the brain and cut it out, or biopsy it and say, pull out a chunk of the brain and say, aha, there's the mind parasite. Because bad ideas are encoded in neural connections that can be distributed across the brain.
David Beam, can you come in? And you have a question.
This is probably outside the scope of this particular subject, but to me, it's an important piece that for anybody who wanted to read your book and get anything out of it, whatever your idea is, you almost have to get to it. And that's the idea that about emotions themselves. I mean, how do you can't be a critical thinker if you're angry or if you're euphorically happy or whatever. I mean, how do we address people to when they get into the critical thinking, to get out of those reptilian emotions, get into the critical thinking part? So again, if that's not too far outside the scope of this discussion, it's fine.
No, that's a wonderful question. No, I think so most of us probably knew this at some level already, but when you're angry, it's hard to think in a fair-minded way, right?
Or if you're euphoric as well.
Right. Well, so if the mind's immune system, if its job is to judiciously assess ideas and weed out the genuinely bad ones, then it's pretty easy to see that anger is the wrong attitude to bring to an idea assessment task, right? Partisan. If you're trying to win a culture war, if you're trying to destroy your cultural opponents, that's the wrong attitude to bring towards an idea assessment task. Because again, it hijacks the mind's immune system and turns what should be a filtering mechanism that screens out falsehoods into something that screens out things that just happen to be threatening to whatever view you already hold. So the language of mental immune systems, the language of cognitive immunology, I think, gives us more insight into what kinds of emotions should be allowed to flourish within critical discourse and what kinds of emotions shouldn't. Look, I think the passion to find out, that's a very good emotion to bring to inquiry and to dialogue. But anger and bitterness, those are not fruitful emotions to bring. And I think this emerging field of cognitive immunology sheds light on the kind of emotions we need to master. You need to modulate your moods in certain ways to become a skilled idea. And I think your question illustrates that in a really nice way.
Joyce has a question, and I'll read it here, Joyce Lackey. Do we need another Independence Hall meeting where folks go in with ideas of hammering out differences? Actually, the number of organizations devoted to this is growing. Is this hopeful?
Wow, lovely question, Joyce. Thank you.
Yeah,
yeah, I think that's a really good, a really nice suggestion. So I believe the reference to Independence Hall is perhaps what during the Constitutional Convention, where the founders actually had to sit down and work through some really tough questions, but because they had a shared goal of coming up with a framework that really works for all of us, they were able to work through a lot of those differences and come up with a framework that, for all its imperfections, had some virtues as well. So yeah, I think we need to hammer out a shared solution. That's the right motivating goal in conversation. So for many years, for a few years, I taught in ways that failed to get my students really excited about philosophical questions. And then what I did is change my approach, where I basically said, all right, some of you guys are kind of pragmatists, some of you guys are Stoics, and some of you guys are Christians, and some of you guys are Muslims, and all of that's great. That's fine. Bring your perspectives. But for the next hour and a half, we're going to try to talk through the fundamental nature of morality and try to hammer out a shared understanding of what morality really is. I set my students a shared goal. Together, we have to work this thing through and come to a deeper understanding of the nature of right and wrong. And the classes I was teaching would just come alive, because when you set a group of young adults on a task of hammering out shared understanding, they will rise to and give them the right environment to do that. They will rise to the occasion. They will learn how to have fruitful dialogue. They will learn to rethink things. Their minds will open, their minds will expand, and their minds will come alive. And I had the good fortune to work with thousands of students like this. And this method I've used, I call it the way of inquiry, I talk about it in the book, has extraordinary power, I think. Well, first of all, it's the way of inquiry always has as a goal to come out of the session with more extensive and deeper shared understanding. And imagine how Washington politics might be different if Republicans and Democrats entered into a conference meeting with that same goal and actually knew how to have the kind of conversations that would further that goal. That would be politics that's wholly different from the politics we have today, and it would be so much healthier.
We're looking at your term, the cognitive immunology, and thinking about medical immunology. Since I happen to have an immune system issue, and COVID is definitely something that affects the immune system. And it's a very complicated area of study with many identified and unidentified factors.
Yes.
Vitamins, minerals, hormones, even the idea that relaxation can cause hormones which affect your immune system. And I was just thinking about that, this whole idea also would affect the cognitive immune system, the whole idea of this relaxation. That's just a comment.
I love it. Yes, I did do a lot of research on how the body's immune system works so that I could develop this analogy fully. And you're right, the body's immune system is enormously complex and responsive to we're only beginning to learn how complicated it is. One of the things we have learned about the body's immune system is that it functions well in kind of what you might call a Goldilocks zone. When it's overactive, it can attack the body's own tissues. That's called autoimmunity. But when it's underactive, it might fail to fight off COVID, or might fail to, and HIV compromises your body's ability to spot and remove microbes, dangerous microbes of various kinds. Well, it turns out these relationships all hold in the realm of cognitive immunology too. When our minds become, when our questioning impulse becomes overactive, you can become too skeptical for your own good. And if your mind is underactive and doesn't raise the right kinds of questions, it can become more susceptible. It can be weakened in another way. So yeah, I think there's a huge frontier here that will help us understand the operations of the mind's immune system. It is, I guarantee you, very complicated, but some of the core principles are coming into focus and validating what many of us know as the importance of reason-giving dialogue that brings when you bring goodwill into a good reason-giving dialogue and seek shared understanding, your mind's immune system gets stronger. We know that much, and we know enough now to begin spreading this news so that we can begin strengthening our mental immune systems against derangement of various kinds.
Andy, when I spent many years at the Oregon Burn Center, and so wound healing was a major topic in my life. And when I started 30 plus years ago, probably closer to 35, well, more than that. Anyway, there was maybe 30 processes for wound healing. It was presented quite simply. And now, after all this time, they realize they really don't understand it at all. I mean, just a little bit, and that there's hundreds of thousands of processes they're trying to figure out. So, you know, you presenting this is the first time in my mind I've ever heard anything like this. And I'm just finding it fascinating that, you know, how complicated it really is, and it'll be more complicated as time goes on. I
think that's right. And but to underscore this even more, think about how important so our understanding of the body's immune system is hugely incomplete.
Yes.
And yet it's enough to allowed us to have saved hundreds of millions of lives with vaccines.
Yes. Yes.
So some of the early knowledge of cognitive immunology, I think, has similar potential to just transform the human condition and reduce suffering. We just need to take it seriously, develop the science, and then apply its findings. But yes, the frontier, it will continue to get complicated over time.
Right. Renga, you have a question. Can you come on, please?
It's not that every time we have the question of the bad ideas influencing and then creating consequences. We have also several examples of, a good idea being influenced or infected by another idea, which is not necessarily bad, but it's a different point of view. But many a time, this is based on some belief system, and then the person trying to influence it uses the arguments and tries to find the consequences of that in downstream and say how they will help or not help against the existing things.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, there are many examples. Some of them are like the argument between Einstein and Bohr about quantum mechanics, trying to influence each other. Mm-hmm. And there are also, for example, in cosmology, you have this anthropic principle and people coming up with multi-universes. Okay, now, not only to solve a problem, there it is solve every problem. Okay, now, so that's epic. Or we have had examples, for example, of when we are looking at whether the genetic whether it is how much is due to behavior, how much is due to innate these things. Okay, this questions, it raises really a lot of other conflicting views, and not necessarily that every one of them is right or wrong, but it has got its own consequences and downstream things. So there are many such interactions do take place, and in a positive manner, not necessarily that it is something going to create wrong or harmful to the society. So how does one deal with that? What are your comments on such activities?
Yeah. So I've been focusing, I spoke a lot about bad ideas causing harm. So the wrong ideas can spread through a population and radicalize half a population. We're seeing that play out today. But it's not as though those ideas arrived on a blank slate. So the people who were receptive to QAnon ideas, the people who were receptive to the big lie about the US election being stolen, they bring backgrounds and belief systems to the task of assessing these new ideas. And a lot of times it's the belief they've already bought into that make it hard for them to see why these ideas are really bad. So there's a relationship here. Bad idea, a mind can fill up with bad ideas and come unhinged. And the more unhinged a mind is, the more bad ideas it will continue to accept. Yeah. Right. So there's so belief systems that are out of kilter can attract more bad ideas, and bad ideas can begin to knock a mind out of kilter as well. And I think one of the most important lessons for this is to understand the importance of what I call subtractive learning. I think our educational system is built on the idea of adding knowledge to a stockpile that's stored in the mind. But until we fully come to grips with the fact that that subtracting out the bad information and removing the wrong ideas and removing the dysfunctional ideas is also part of learning. I call that subtractive learning. Until we've fully integrated that into our educational system, I think we're going to struggle to deal with stubbornly change-resistant belief systems.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. We've got a question from Joyce. Do we need an immune system for the internet?
Nice question. Wow. So yeah, so think a few of you are probably old enough to remember what it was like pre-internet. I certainly am. Our minds came into contact with far fewer other minds pre-internet. And so, and because bad ideas spread by, are transmitted in conversations, and we're now having conversations with many more people, all of us are, in a certain sense, I mean, the social distancing has declined. We're more connected with other minds, and that means we're more susceptible to bad ideas. So the internet has actually created a condition where cognitive contagion can flourish. And I don't think we've yet evolved the mental immunity to deal with it. I think we've reached a point in our species cultural evolution where if we don't develop our mental immune systems to compensate for our greater degree of connectivity, we're in for a really, really tough time. So we can either get rid of the internet, or we can develop the science and apply the science of cognitive immunology. Got to do one of those. We can't have both.
Yeah, the question may have sounded somewhat flippant, but I was thinking about Independence Hall. Those people kept what they were doing secret until they were done. They didn't get influx from hundreds of thousands of people as they tried to do their work.
And maybe they should have gotten more input from, say, people with dark skin, right?
Yeah.
There you go.
But would that conversation have been even tractable if millions of people were all weighing in?
That's
tens of thousands?
Yeah.
Sure enough. You just used the term cultural evolution. It occurs to me that this mental immune system may have some kind of a hardware substrate, but that it's got to be maybe 99% nurture and culture, and very little of anything else. Which means that the way that it has to be passed from generation to generation also has to grow up by nurture and culture. And that, not only that, but that same system has to grow up by nurture and culture. So you're essentially, you're roller skating on a skateboard. And how many layers of turtles there are below you, I have no idea. But the system has to be inherently unstable. Human thought has to careen wildly this way and that way, and looking at things through history, certainly it has in the past. It seems inevitable that it's just human intellect is just an unstable system, and maybe we should just approach it as that and try to just maybe put safety belts on or something. I don't know, but can you say that there's a way that you can control this thing?
Yeah, well, so the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus argued that everything is in flux, and argued that if we come to terms with our impermanence, with the changing nature of everything, then we'll be less likely to try to control our surroundings and might actually develop a kind of more harmonious relationship with the natural processes around us. It could be that we've actually been trying to control the idea sphere, and the idea sphere is fundamentally unruly, and that we actually have to come to grips with the inherent instabilities in idea space and make our peace with that. So everybody who craves utterly certain, permanent, eternal knowledge and is disappointed by not being able to find much can be drawn into skepticism, this idea that, oh, well, it's all just opinion, right? We don't really know anything, because that kind of global sweeping skepticism is not conducive to healthy mental immune function. So yes, there's a kind of instability and impermanence in idea space, and that means we should be willing to make our peace with ideas that have achieved a kind of temporary stability in our systems of thought. We need to stop craving complete permanence and stability in our thinking. But the book argues that you can achieve a kind of cognitive closure without closed-mindedness. You don't actually need to just simply close your mind and say, well, I'm just accepting it, to heck with everything else, to actually achieve stable conviction that is stable across significant periods of time, or for significant purposes. I mean, some ideas are actually quite stable over time.
Okay.
And yes, we can focus on the more unstable ones and learn from that, but we can also need to remind ourselves that there are many ideas that are more stable, and we can learn to rely on the more stable ones and to rely less on the unstable ones. And I think that the process makes us wiser.
Close with one comment from Dorman Blazer. He likes the book, Sam Harris, The Moral Landscape, and that he tries to stay away himself from the culture wars. And also a comment, 200 people size is limit for science and exploration. I think working together, this group, that people work best in smaller groups.
Yeah, there is, I guess, some pretty good evidence that our ancestors grew up in tribes where they knew about, I think, 150 people max, I think is the number some sociologists use. And that our minds work relatively well for managing up to 150 relationships, but then they start to get distinctly uncomfortable and maybe even anxiety ridden when we're surrounded by, or we try to maintain too many relationships. I don't understand this research really well, but it could well be that our minds evolved with certain limits, and that until we understand those limits and maybe redesign the internet to work with our mental limits rather than against them. Maybe that's one of the things the designers of the next generation of the internet need to be thinking about.
Andy, we've come to the end of our time. We're going to have to stop, but I'm very happy to say you're going to stay on during Afterthoughts. Am I correct?
I'd like that.
Okay, wonderful. So we'll continue the conversation, but I would like to give you a rousing applause. Your presentation was excellent and got my mind really thinking about a lot of things.